I'm pretty sure you're aware of the term emotional intelligence. Otherwise, why would you end up here? For those of us who might be a little bit unsure what emotional intelligence means, I'm going to read out a quote, a definition from Wikipedia. Emotional intelligence is the capability of individuals to recognize their own emotions and those of others, discern between different feelings and label them appropriately, use emotional information to guide thinking and behavior, and manage and/or adjust emotions to adapt to environments or achieve one's goals. From what I've just read, I'm getting an impression that first, emotional intelligence is a really critical skill for humans. And second, that it's a proficient tool to use for manipulation of others. And if you go to a local bookshop, for instance, you'll be very likely to notice a couple of books where the words emotional intelligence are ingrained in the title of those books. And very often you will notice that those books are directed towards teaching you and me to manipulate and to tinker with emotions of other people so that we can get closer to reaching our survival needs. Personally, I have an axe to grind with this definition of emotional intelligence as far as its second aspect is concerned. What I'd love to get across to you today is that emotional intelligence is as valid in human interaction as critical intelligence, for instance, or critical thinking that people teach a lot these days in English classrooms. And because we're living in a world that is driven by the scientific paradigm predominantly, we're used to thinking in terms of rationality quite a bit. And we put rationality on the pedestal. We put it on top of other lines of intelligence, even though there are countless and multiple lines of intelligence that we can name in human development. Developmental psychology is one of those sciences that takes hold of all of those various lines of development, including mathematical intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, cognitive intelligence, that being very close to critical thinking skills that are perpetuated in the world of ELT these days, and other types of intelligence. How about artistic intelligence, for example, or creative intelligence? How about scientific intelligence? Things like that. Those multiple lines of intelligences comprise every human's field of development. We may be very high in certain lines of development, and nowadays, more and more individuals are gravitating towards learning to think critically, to discern between various types of information, and very, very low in other lines of intelligence. For instance, many people may think that rationality is to be worshipped at the expense of emotional intelligence, for instance, because emotions are very often misregarded as something inferior to critical thinking, for instance, whereas neither side is more important, is superior or inferior when compared with the other. They're equally important, just like all the rest of the lines of intelligence. I'm a language teacher who is interested in teaching language in a way that contributes to people's well-being. I'm really interested in teaching the English language in a way that creates effective communication, effective exchange of ideas, respectful communication, and fulfilling communication. Since language is the predominant means of communication in the world these days, it's within our field of work and understanding as to how we can learn and teach our learners to use the language in a way that contributes to our well-being rather than takes away from it. With that in mind, I'd really love to reformulate the definition of emotional intelligence for a moment so that it does not include manipulation, but is more directed towards mutual empowerment and a more rewarding life in these circumstances that we're finding ourselves increasingly in. I really want to share with you how I teach using emotional intelligence and how I teach emotional intelligence specifically. The first and very valid skill that every human being should be capable of doing is effectively mirroring the other person when the other person is sharing their experience. Think back to a recent interaction you've had with a friend or an acquaintance or a family member. Notice that they were sharing some info with you. They were sharing some information. They were trying to get across a message over to you. What they were actually trying to get across to you was their experience. They were looking at the world and their participation in that world in a certain way. And when they were talking to you, they were trying to let you taste a tiny bit of that experience of theirs. Notice how you reacted to their experience sharing. Notice if you found their experience inappropriate, and maybe you started contradicting their experience, maybe you started arguing with them, trying to argue your way of looking at that experience. And maybe that was even dictated, and I'm very sure that it was, by a very benevolent intention. I'm very sure you were trying to alleviate the situation that they found themselves in. One adverse side of this kind of interaction that you and I engage in on a daily basis, if we're not working on increasing our skill of effective interaction specifically, is that we don't hear the other person's experience. And therefore, we don't have an opportunity to respond to the reality of that person. So we leave them alone, we leave them lonely in their reality. They keep wallowing in that reality and we don't join them. Therefore, the epitome of loneliness happening on this planet Earth. If we were to take a different approach to interacting with that person via language, via saying specific things when they're sharing their experience with us, in a way that reflects the fact that we're hearing their experience and that we're taking their experience as it is, if we were to take that standpoint, if we were to adopt that stance, our interactions and relationships with other human beings would immediately improve. So I'm going to teach you a little technique of emotional mirroring that I love to do with my students. Whenever someone is sharing their experience with you, bear in mind that it's not your role to be the teacher of life to that person. What they're sharing is relevant from their perspective, and what they're sharing is real from their perspective. Perhaps they're trying to manipulate you a little bit, just as most of us do in this current phase of development. But that is exactly the thing that we're wanting to shift and to encourage to go in a different direction, to turn in a different direction. When a person is telling us that they're feeling unwell today, maybe they're feeling emotionally bad or they're feeling frustrated, it's natural for us, especially if we love that person, to suggest a solution. So what we might naturally try and do is try to fix their problem immediately. In the process of doing that, we reinterpret their problem. We give additional shades to their original problem. And what we're solving as a result is not necessarily their particular problem, but the tainted interpretation of their problem that we have created for ourselves. So back to our example, if anyone were telling me that they're feeling upset, if a student were sharing with me that they're feeling upset on that particular day, I wouldn't go, oh, everything is fine. I wouldn't say, there's nothing to be upset about. The same goes for family relationships and things like that. What I would do is I would reflect back to them that I can hear that they're feeling upset. I would say, all right, I can see that you're feeling upset. Oh, okay, it really makes sense to me that you're feeling upset. If I were in your position, I would feel upset too. By saying that, you're relating with another human being in a way that is conducive to them living through that emotion in a company of someone who is being very supportive and encouraging of their experience. So the likelihood of them going through that emotion faster is much higher when compared to the likelihood of them going through that emotion on their own, trying to suppress or disown that emotion. And very often we do nudge each other into suppressing and disowning our emotions when we fail to recognise the reality of a person's emotion in its so-ness. Here is a good teaching tip. Some language that you can teach here is mostly functional. For instance, you might teach expressions that paraphrase the other person's mood or feeling, while keeping to the gist or the idea of what the feeling is about. If a student were telling me, I'm feeling really upset today, a mirroring technique for me might look something like this. I can see your frustration. What could it be about? You could bring those questions by generating them first into your classroom and hand them out to your students if you're teaching a group, or put them up on board on Zoom or in a brick and mortar classroom if you're teaching an individual, for instance, or a group of learners. And you could ask the learners to share their feelings in this current moment in time with each other by practicing mirroring expressions, some of which I have already demonstrated in this little video today. Another little activity that I often observe teachers doing is perspective travel. A teacher might show a learner a video clip where different characters are interacting in a certain manner. And then the teacher will ask the student to step into the shoes of every character in that video clip and look at reality from their perspective. Another variation of this activity is to give your student a bunch of nouns, such as fascists, Afro-American people, LGBT people, politicians, the military, or different types and groups that exist as collective nouns in our experience, in how we represent reality. And then you may ask your learner to see what worldviews and what associations come to mind when they're thinking about those people as a collective whole. See if they can explore the differences in the worldview. I know that some of you might be feeling rather uncomfortable watching this video right now and listening to this stuff, because you may think that a language classroom is not a place for creating separation. Because, for instance, and it's a very valid concern, a teacher might be worried that part of the learners may feel as if they're being excluded from discussion because their views are in the minority, for instance. But that's exactly the issue that I'm trying to address. I'm not asking you to create a separation between your language classroom and reality. What I'm trying to ask you to do is put the two together, to congeal and merge and fuse the two. Only by doing that, only by stopping creating that artificial separation between real life and language learning, will we be able to create a more inclusive community. By exploring how different worldviews might be different from each other, your learners will get a taste of what it feels like to be born in a poor family, for instance, or in an affluent neighbourhood, for example. They might explore the reasons for why people do certain things, why they choose to do certain things. You might ask your learners to think about terrorists and make sure that you're supporting an atmosphere of open-mindedness in your classroom. Make sure, when discussing terrorists, for example, that you don't let your students slide down into a really demeaning or diminishing perspective. Make sure you don't create a caricature way of looking at the world through a terrorist's eyes, for instance. Whatever a person is doing, they're doing that for a reason, and they're justifying that to themselves. And that's exactly the way of looking at things that you want to promote in your language classroom. Diving into emotions and exploring them as they are for every learner is another great practice. Here you can use descriptive language and practice descriptive vocabulary, such as, well, If you could visualize that feeling that is bugging you right now, how would you describe it? A person might say that it's a triangle. They might say that it's a wet puddle. They might say that it's a dirty pond, anything like that. You could ask them to go home and write a story or a description, like an entry for their reflection journal of their emotions. The goal of all this endeavour is to create in your classroom an atmosphere of mutual trust and authentic expression. Make sure you create a safe container for your learners to self-express authentically. Make sure you don't gaslight your learners. Make sure you give them room to express their internal reality as it is. And make sure you supply them with relevant language to do so. Thank you so much for staying with me. Make sure you click the like button if you have found this content useful and educational, and share this video with a friend if you think they would benefit from watching it. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon.